Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm talking about the new album from STS9, Chromalight. Sound Tribe's Sector 9 is a 5-piece instrumental jam band based in Santa Cruz, California, best known for their incorporation of electronics into their improvisational live band setting, combining elements of jazz, rock, electronic, funk, and more all together at once. I've been a fan of this band for a long time now. In fact, this isn't even the first time I've reviewed them. Way back in 2016, I covered their album The Universe Inside, although that video is very old, and from the days when I was just starting out as a reviewer, before I could confidently deliver to camera or actually got good at writing. So, you know, it is not essential viewing. Now, depending on who you ask, it may be slightly unorthodox to even be doing a regular album review like this for a band like STS9. This is very much a band whose primary appeal is not so much their albums, but rather their live shows. Being a jam band and all, with a lot of their focus on live improvisation, making sure no two shows of theirs will ever be exactly the same. And I will also have to admit that as of recording this video, I still have not yet seen them live in person. Now before you come at me, I do in fact have a ticket to see them this October, so you can expect a vlog for that when the time comes, but that'll be my first STS9 concert. Any of my other exposure of their live sets is just through what they've uploaded through other releases. They did once have like a 5-hour 2-part compilation of live sets called STS9 2.0 on Spotify. Doesn't appear to be up there in its full entirety anymore. Though, to make up for it, their Bandcamp page currently has recordings of nearly every single live set they've ever performed, so there is lots to browse through. However, as much importance as their live shows have, they have obviously released many regular studio albums over the years, stretching as far back as the late 90s, and it's through said albums that I became a fan in the first place. Most notably through their album Artifact from 2005, which made the cut for my old list of my top 100 favorite electronic albums of all time back in 2016, ranking at number 52 on that list. Given the vast majority of their live shows directly pull from the material on these albums, just as is the case for literally any other band, I don't see any reason why their albums can't be judged on their own merits. It's been such a long time since I've gotten an opportunity to cover this band in a video, and I felt like they could probably deserve something better than the video I made 8 years ago. So I took the opportunity of the release of this new album to also go back and refresh myself on my thoughts on their old albums, as well as go a little more in-depth on them than I did before. By the way, I am including live albums in this discussion, but only if the material on there is all original and doesn't overlap with any of their other albums, which does account for a decent chunk of their album discography, including the latest one I'm going to be reviewing. A lot of the times it won't be that easy to tell apart the studio recordings from the live ones to begin with, so if they were released with an actual title and have all unique material, they can be treated as regular albums. So yeah, with all that out of the way, here's my thoughts on their discography so far. Right, to start with, their debut in 1999 doesn't actually feature much of any electronic elements. It's instead focused entirely on rock and funk instrumentation. Pretty much just 70 minutes straight of jamming over funky grooves and absolutely nothing else. Not exactly a lot to it, but it's a solidly fun listen anyway. All those grooves are really strong and well performed, all those tracks go pretty hard and nail down lots of nice uplifting feel-good vibes that are easy to zone out to, with a level of visceral energy and propulsion that would take more of a backseat in subsequent albums. And there's a bunch of tracks from here that still remain regular staples in their live shows to this day, like Moon Socket, Wika Chicana, Tap In, and 4-Year Puma. It's a pretty good start. This album, meanwhile, shows them expanding their instrumental palette quite a bit, getting a lot jazzier and more organic sounding, including lots of really nice keyboard and flute performances, with some more sentimental and emotional cuts such as Otherwise Formless or liquid jazz fusion meditations like Kamui. And it's also where the electronic elements start to come in, mostly in the way of several drum and bass bangers like Squares and Cubes or And Summer Angels. But there's still some time for the funkiness seen on their debut, showing up on the epic closer EB. This is another album where certain moments hit more than others, and it does lose steam for me near the end. The moments I've mentioned here are all my favorites. But yeah, this is all around another strong effort and an improvement on the debut. Now, this was actually the first STS9 project I ever heard. My dad's cousin burned a copy for me as a random recommendation when I was in high school, which obviously got me interested enough to check them out more in depth. Sonically continues off the same laid-back and jazzy territory as Offered Schematic suggesting peace, but the arrangements here are a lot more open-ended than even those on that album, directly taken from improv sessions performed live at various dates. And it's also a 2-hour double album with more than half the tracks on display stretching well over 10 minutes and one track approaching 20 minutes. But despite the length and how loose and carefree the vibe of the whole thing is, it's not an uninteresting listen either. The longer tracks tend to have more of a sense of evolution and exploration, and even in the slowest moments, the breezy and uplifting vibe is nailed well enough to carry it anyway. The almost 20-minute track Ramona and Emiglia is probably my favorite, but other highlights of note include Jabez, Good for Everyday, Eclipse, and Thread. The latter two get markedly more electronic in a cool way. Whole thing's pretty consistent in any case. Right, somehow I skipped over this album last time I did the In Brief segment on this band, I guess because I mistakenly thought the word live in the title meant this wouldn't qualify as a main album or something. But this is just as much a main album as Seasons 01 was, if not even more so, since these cuts, true to the title, were all recorded at the band members' own homes. The structure of this one is way more fragmented, 23 mostly shorter tracks which can range anywhere from 48 seconds to 7 minutes, and there's a big shift in sound too, focusing a lot more on a lo-fi instrumental hip-hop and trip-hop style with more experimental and glitch elements. Easily their most unambiguously electronic work up to this point hits on some, like, Los Angeles era Flying Lotus or early Boards of Canada vibes without actually sounding like those guys. Now, given the manner in which it was made and structured, it's probably not much of a surprise to hear that the album's pretty messy and all over the place. A lot of tracks can feel like unfinished sketches, and they don't really add up to more than the sum of their parts, but the album still delves into a lot of interesting and varied territory with lots of strange and out-of-the-box ideas that aren't quite comparable to anything else in their catalog. With lots of genuinely striking gems. See Luna Sunrise, Eagle, Like That, Purity 2, Tact, Summit, just to name a few. And even in this thing's worst moments, you still get some nice lo-fi beats to study too. I never gave this one a proper chance back in the days when I was first getting into these guys, so it may have the potential to further grow on me yet. But Live at Home is just a lead-up to this album, which isn't just a massive improvement upon all the new directions that project introduced, integrated more seamlessly into their usual live band sound. It probably won't surprise anyone to hear me say that I think this is still their best album by some distance and holds up as one of my favorites of all time. I will say it's the kind of project that requires a certain level of commitment out of the listener in order for everything to grow on you. There's a ton to digest with 20 tracks that may run together on the surface, and all of it focuses on a rather subtle and laid-back sound unlikely to wow people on first listen. Also, it is front-loaded with most of my biggest favorite cuts in the first half, especially Better Day as the opener being one of the most heart-rendingly beautiful ballads ever to exist and my easy favorite track they've ever done. But once I got to a certain level of familiarity with the full project, it solidified itself as one of my biggest go-to comfort food listens for the better part of a decade now. There's so many of their all-time best tracks here. Tokyo, Glowgly, Possibilities, By the Morning Sun, Peoples, Native End, Music Us, and plenty more. Also, while it's not a continuous mix, it's actually been informative to the way I often approach albums with continuous mixes, since all of these songs are written to be, like, in conversation with one another. Each track feels like it's directly continuing off the ideas of the previous one, and like the whole thing is continually, gradually evolving into new territory. Yeah, absolute freaking masterwork here. Now, this one was a pretty major change of pace. STS9 up to this point has always been a pretty mellow band, but this album got significantly heavier than anything they'd done previously. There is time for some of the mellower and jazzier side to this project too, but on average the drumming is louder and harder hitting, the guitars have a lot more edge to them, and there's a lot of aggressive electro elements brought in as well, one of their most synth-focused records yet. The closest comparison point I can think of might be the electro hip-hop stuff Pretty Lights was really popularizing at the time, but it still sounds pretty different from that too. It's coming about that sound from more their rock and jam band background and not relying on any samples, obviously. And it's a surprisingly heady listen as well, despite how much darker and more aggressive it got. Doesn't sound quite like any other album I've ever heard either from them or any other band or artist for that matter. Similar deal with this one. I guess this kinda continues off the sound of Peace Blaster, but it also kinda does its own thing, which is even headier and harder to pin down. Like, there are parts of this that sound like 70s synth pioneers, parts that sound like old heavy metal with flashy guitar solos, parts that sound kinda instrumental hip-hop-ish, parts that get jazzier or more psychedelic, parts that sound like Boards of Canada, parts that sound almost a little predictive of the dubstep scene but also not quite, and parts that are a mix of any of those or somewhere in between. I'm not even naming tracks in particular because tracks could have several of those at once. It's a very odd project, but odd in a good way. Keeps me feeling intrigued and like there's a lot of depth below the surface. Lives up to the explorative feeling promised by its title. Worth hearing for the run of Re-Stereo, Central, and Lion at the very least. This is just an EP, although it was one of their more successful and well-known releases, so I threw it in here anyway. This plays more to the EDM and dubstep crowd than anything else they'd done before, even if it isn't quite either of those things. Still a little closer to Pretty Light's electro-hip-hop minus any of the sampling. The first two tracks are solid. I like all the vocoder rapping on Scheme and the steady evolution and eventual climax of the title track. Though the rest you can probably skip. The track Golden Gate might be my least favorite track they've ever done. Really ugly sounding production with some awful saw leads, and a kinda rudimentary tune. And the other two cuts are too insubstantial to be worth noting. EP's just okay as a whole. Okay, I don't know if anyone considers this a main album. It's a one-off live set that got released as an album once and you can download for free off their Bandcamp page. But there's no overlap between the material on this project and any of the other albums I've talked about here, so I thought, I guess that technically counts. The main notable thing about this show is that it was 100% improv. All of it composed on the fly that particular night. There was also a track or two that might have gone on to also become off and on live show staples. It wouldn't be the last time the track Modular would be performed, for instance. Incidentally, that track and its two surrounding cuts, Piano Noir, Outro, and D&B are probably the best ones here. But yeah, a lot of cool stuff and a neat window into their creative process. This marked another major change of pace for the band, easily their most pop-centric release yet, with lots of new disco grooves and a whole bunch of tracks featuring all these glossy and polished pop and soul vocal performances that I seem to recall getting somewhat mixed reactions from fans at the time. My thoughts haven't shifted too much since way back when I made my video on it. A few of the vocal performances can in fact get a little cheesy, see Get Loud for the most egregious example, and the album tends to be at its best when it focuses more on the band's usual cosmic and open-ended jamming over the poppier elements, see Totem, the back half of Give and Take, Elsewhere, and especially New Dawn, New Day, among others. But some of the pop tunes here are standouts too, like Out of This World, and especially Worry No More, even if the latter's bizarre outro kinda derails it a little. Despite this album's comparatively mindless party-centric approach, the whole thing's still an all-around fun time with a couple of my favorite individual moments from them. Not gonna lie, I completely missed this one when it came out, though to be fair I don't think it would have merited a full video of discussion if I had heard it back then and I didn't have Some Stuff I Missed roundups yet back in 2018. This is just a random project that came about when the band moved into a new studio. It doesn't represent any kind of new direction for them besides just being a bunch of spacey jam sessions that sound like the exact average of what you would expect out of their work, with a bit of a lo-fi mastering job. I wouldn't be surprised if they recorded the whole thing in a day or something. If I'm being brutally honest, this is probably my least favorite of all the projects discussed in this marathon, though it's not bad or unenjoyable so much as it is just kind of forgettable and inessential more than anything. Which finally brings us to here. I know there's plenty of material those albums don't cover. There's enough live show exclusive cuts in their repertoire to fill at least 2 or 3 more full albums. But for a band who puts so many eggs in the basket of their live shows, I do think their regular album catalog is strong and diverse enough where I wouldn't be against the idea of covering them in a proper series someday. Obviously, given the length of that in brief segment, there's absolutely no shortage of discussion material there. Nearly every new studio album from them represented something new for the band and took them into then unexplored new territory, and a lot of those albums, especially through the mid and later 2000s, are the kind of thing that require a lot of fully attentive listening and re-listening to reap longer-term rewards. Now getting into this new album, Chromalight. Given this album's status is taking directly from 2 separate live performances at Red Rocks last year, and it's being billed as a multi-sensory experience to which the light show was designed as an integral part, I wasn't necessarily expecting anything too far afield of what they've already done before or some kind of bold new chapter for them. But But, you know, it's been a very long time since they promoted an actual full-length album like this, so I was still intrigued to see what we got here. Again, I am reviewing this live album without having seen the show in person or experiencing how the light show actually plays into this, but they released it as a regular album and advertised it like one, so again, I don't see any reason why I shouldn't be able to judge it purely on those merits. Now, in one breath, I did have a certain level of expectation about the style and sound of this project that were all pretty much met exactly the way I thought they'd be. At this point in STS9's history, with over 25 years in the game, they've finally kind of started to settle into a sort of comfort zone that kind of mixes elements of all their eras. Some of the open-ended and more organic jamming of their early work, some of the more electronic-heavy explorations of their middle period work, the looser pop and dance energy that came through in their more recent era since the Universe Inside. All those elements blended together at the same time without any one side to their sound getting any particular focus over the other. Just their usual mix of electronics and live band jam sessions that you would expect out of them, without any risk-taking or unexpected swings for the fences. Now, given how much this band liked to take risks in the past, one could theoretically find this fact disappointing. Although, first of all, I do feel like Wave Spell sort of set the stage for this. And at least it does feel like a fair bit more thought and care was put into this album than that one. Not being anything revolutionary for them is perfectly fine, so long as they still have the tunes to back themselves up. And for the most part, I think they do here. Though what is particularly interesting about Chromalight as an album is that even without having seen the light show myself, I can tell just from the way the music is being composed on this thing that it was written specifically with a certain kind of light show in mind. Like, in such a way where I could even very loosely envision what that light show might look like just based off the music and nothing else. See, plenty of other STS9 projects might have their tracks written around the groove or bass line first, or some kind of general loosely sketched vibe first. But Chromalight's tracks are nearly all written around melodic arpeggios of some kind, played on either synths or guitars or both, either stepping up and down various scales in sequence, or occasionally forming simpler melodic hooks out of limited ranges of notes, to make it all the easier to sync up with, say, a series of colored spotlights with each color corresponding to a note, or something to that effect, as the Bandcamp description seems to sort of hint at. That may not be one-to-one what it actually looks like, but the fact that the music makes it so easy to envision in that way is actually pretty cool. It's definitely something unique that the album can call its own in the greater context of their catalog. Now, the album is sort of split into two halves. The first half comprising the first 7 tracks having been taken from their July 21st performance, and the second half taken from their July 22nd performance, with both halves having their own intro tracks, Reveal Intro and Obscure Intro, also known as Light Reveals and Light Obscures on the original set lists available elsewhere on their Bandcamp page. Although there's no thematic difference between the two halves outside of that, and I will have to also say that the first half was markedly stronger than the second for me. Perhaps a part of that is a sequencing thing, and the fact that tracks here like Reveal, Intro, and Haze are kind of setting the tone for what to expect out of the sound of the whole project, in a way that maybe wouldn't be as obvious if the two halves were reversed. Though I do feel like both of those tracks did have among the stronger melodies on display here, and I did feel there were more tracks in this first half that had, like, an idea that stuck out to me more. I really liked tracks like Darkest Before Dawn and Halos for having this much more sentimental tone to them, and having a lot of very pretty piano performances in their mixes. The former of those add some vibraphones to the background, which are a particularly nice touch, and the latter might be the biggest emotional heavy hitter on the album delivered through its big triumphant chord progressions. Either that or the closer, which I'll get to later. I like how Habitat kind of starts out having like a faux Indian influence, complete with tablas and synth imitation sitars, before really building into this really dense-sounding energetic rush by the end. Dreamstate Patrol is a foreboding title if there ever was one, but in spite of that is surprisingly relaxed, leaning into the Dreamstate part and not the Patrol part of that title. And while this track didn't really stick out to me much on first listen, it's probably the single biggest grower for me on the album, as that low-key melodic guitar hook running through the whole thing just started to stick in my mind more easily, and the kind of washed-out sound being complemented by these whooping sound effects at the end of each bar is a neat effect. And of course there's the album's 7-minute centerpiece and lead single, Searchlight, which definitely spins the formula behind this record in such a way that doesn't sound like any other song here. The way it starts out with all these really simple 3-note melodic riffs being simultaneously played on every instrument, and creating this oddly menacing and robotic sort of effect, and one of the catchier hooks. But halfway through, it switches over to this much spacier set of harmonies in a really cool way and became a lot more cosmic and open-ended, and that was just really cool. That track definitely kicked ass. As we move into the second half of the album, though, I do feel like my enthusiasm starts to trail off a little bit. While this almost certainly wasn't a problem for the people who were actually there to see the stuff live, playing both of these sets one after the other does mean there's going to be some redundancy here, and tracks which continue the general formula set by earlier tracks like Reveal Intro and Haze, without doing as much to stand out in their own right. Tracks like Obscure Intro and Refraction just kind of bounce off me in context, and do the same formula other tracks here did better without adding any kind of interesting spin on the sound to set themselves apart. Other tracks like Cave in the Light with all its descending scales, or Fires with its more straightforward melodic riffs are a little stronger, but still aren't quite as interesting standouts to me as some of the stuff that appeared in the first half. Though there are definitely a couple of big standouts of note in the second half as well. So Much More is totally different from anything else on the album, and instead switches over to taking a little from the playbook of The Universe Inside, in the way these semi-cutesy pop vocal performances start showing up and getting focused on and layering on top of each other in a cool way. Not to mention the instrumental they're being built on top of is really different too, and how it starts with entirely ambient synth string pads and eventually builds into like a drum and bass influenced groove. That track's really nice. And I do feel like the album does end really strongly as well. First with the track Skyspace, which, despite focusing on all the same kind of melodic arpeggios that most tracks on this album do, it kind of has a different, more uplifting and warm and fuzzy kind of energy to it compared to most of the tracks surrounding it, and does more dense layering of those melodic textures to make it stand out is a little more interesting. But of course, the real showstopper of the album's second half, as alluded to earlier, is of course the album closer Human Dream. The first half of this track sticks to the same arpeggiated formulas at first, but delivers them in a slightly more epic-sounding way, complete with some of the stronger and more exciting bass lines on the album. But of course, this track absolutely goes over the moon in its second half, as everything starts being built around a new, mildly jazzy chord progression that sounds way more emotionally desperate, and makes for such an incredible final climax. That was freaking awesome. But yeah, that's everything on Chromalight. This ain't some kind of incredible life-changing masterwork or anything, and it's not one of my new favorite albums from them ever, but I had a fun time with it. It may not be anything out of the band's usual wheelhouse or pushes their sound forward in any way, but they still had the songs to back themselves up and execute their usual sound well enough where, like, this could fairly easily demonstrate their core appeal to a newcomer. And even if I did feel like there were a number of tracks that felt kind of fillerish in greater context to this album, I do think it says something that I assumed this project was like a standard 50 minutes long, and then I looked into it and realized, no, it's actually 70 minutes long. This fills up a full CD. Could it have been better with a bit more tightening up? Sure, but is it in dire need of editing? No, I wasn't really feeling the length on it. Perhaps my feelings will be evolving more when I finally get to see them live in October. Here's hoping I'll be able to handle the inevitable weed smoke better than I did when I saw DJ Shadow. But yeah, as a standalone album, Chromalight is a fun time and another typically solid addition to their album catalog, and I think it's worth giving a shot if all that sounds interesting to you. I'm overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on this. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.